I recently have been studying what makes a bow shoot an arrow fast, and on my main YouTube channel I've been making a couple of videos around this. Through that process, there's this man named Trey Slickton who got in touch with me and has a lot of experience with this. So today's video is him teaching some major factors to why some bows go faster than others. Now, if you can buckle in and pay attention to what he's saying, this information is fantastic. It taught me a lot and gave me some really interesting ideas around bows and bow making, so I think you're really going to enjoy. So buckle up and relax and enjoy this video.
How you doing? My name's Trey Slickton from Mystic Pines International Horseback Archery Training. I was talking with some friends about making a faster bow, and specifically a faster longbow. So I wanted to talk about what makes a bow fast. You know, the main thing that you have to deal with is mass. I mean, that's the first hurdle. There's several hurdles you want to get into. If you imagine the mass of the limbs on a bull, when it runs through somebody's barbed wire fence, well, then it just rips down the barbed wire fence. Less mass, you have, say, a horse. Horses are faster than bulls. And if they run through a fence, you have a vet bill and a broken fence. But so a deer or an antelope runs through that barbed wire fence. Well, that antelope will break its leg and probably die. And so what's going on? The antelope is the fastest of the three. The horse is in the middle, and the bull is slower. But what makes the antelope fast? Well, it's got pencil-thin appendages. It has almost no mass in its limbs. And so the energy that it stores or it uses to move, it wastes very little of it moving its legs. So it can move its legs majorly fast, and so it's able to propel itself. The bull has a big, heavy, robust, thick leg, and when it wants to move, it has to move that heavy, robust leg. And so the same thing happens in archery with the bow limb. You want to make sure the limb is made with the least amount of mass possible so that it'll move quickly. And one of the advantages that you have with a longbow versus a recurve is that this real thin taper here allows the bow to reduce a lot of mass quickly. That's the first thing to talk about. Kramer's video, he was talking about how the shorter bow, this one here, tends to be faster with the shorter working part of the limb. And yes, that is so much true because it's storing so much energy and it just really wants to snap back. But there's also a counter to that, and that is not always. And why is it not always? Sometimes the longer bow is actually faster. And so what I tried to do is draw here these outlines. In blue, you have the longbow here. This is only a 62-inch longbow. It's short for a longbow. But this is a horsebow longbow, and it's 56 inches. So it's significantly smaller. And so what I did here is draw out the angle of arc on the tips. So if you see this shorter bow, with this, it's storing a lot of energy, but the limb tip is moving almost twice the distance as the limb tip on the longer bow. So what ends up happening is that this bow, from full draw to brace, only has to go half the distance. So many times, that longer bow is actually faster. Kramer's video, he was talking about how the shorter bow, this one here, tends to be faster with the shorter working part of the limb. And yes, that is so much true because it's storing so much energy and it just really wants to snap back. But there's also a counter to that, and that is not always. And why is it not always? Now, there is more mass in the limb here. This much more mass, but it's not an easy 1-to-1 ratio. So you extend the length, you extend the mass. But so how do I take and get the stored energy in the short bow and put it into a long bow? Well, I stole the idea from border bows. What they started doing is making static tips like a saya in some of their bows. And so it's not uncommon, but basically when I had this bow made, there's a thin layer of carbon in between the bamboo lamination. And from the tip down to about 9 or 14 inches, depending on the length of the bow, there's another piece of carbon. That extra piece of carbon makes the limb tip almost inflexible. It still has some flex, but it resists the flex so much. And so what you do is you can take this longer bow, you put that carbon in, or a limb stiffener of sorts, something to stiffen that limb. And you can do that with the way you tiller the bow. And suddenly your working part of the limb is now equal or shorter than that of the shorter bow. And so you get the stored energy that you would normally get in that shorter, and all the limb works here, so it makes the longbow significantly fast. Now, about 20 years ago, O.L. Attic, who was an engineer, developed one of the fastest longbows out there, and he was the one that proved that if you take the curve that you normally see in a recurve, that would be something like this, and you spread that curve out into a reflex defects longbow limb, so you get the same amount of curve, but you spread it out over a longer period, you can reduce the mass on the tip significantly more on this longbow because it's more stable. This real short turn needs a really wide limb, and that gives it more mass. So what he was able to do, and he patented his material design on the inside of the bow. I'm not sure what that is because it's his patent. But what he did is he stored the same energy in the longbow, reflex deflex limb, as it was already stored in the recurve. He had less mass in the limb tip, and so he ended up getting equal or faster longbows than he did recurves. The other thing that you want to talk about is materials. You want to use bamboo whenever you can instead of maple, because bamboo is stronger than steel. It'll bend more than steel and comes back. It's actually a grass, not a wood, and it has almost no mass, but the fibers that elongate in it give it lots of stability. The next fastest material that I know out there is ceramic foam for the core with carbon on the outside. And that's what you see in Olympic style bows. All right, we talked about materials, and we also talked about how far does the limb tip travel for arrow speed. But there's another issue. In one of Kramer's amazing videos, he took a longbow style riser with a very advanced, almost a slow recurve, super reflexed limbs like this. And it was barely stable, but it stored a ton of energy. But when he shot it through his chronograph, it was slower per pound than when he took the same exact limbs and put them on a riser where it attached at this angle and brought the limbs back. And you're asking why? Well, I think one of the reasons why is that the limb tips didn't have to travel from all the way here to way back. They were already angled back to start with. And so while the bow it dropped weight, it still had more speed per pound. And so speed per pound is a great way to level up bows. You can't always get the same bow limbs or the same weight. But if you take the speed of the arrow, say it shoots 270 feet per second, and you divide it by the bow weight, it'll give you a number like 3.2 or 3.8. And what you notice is that when you start using that ratio of speed divided by bow weight, it'll tell you how much speed per pound you're getting and whether the limb design you got is more efficient or less efficient despite the weight of the bow. All right, so why was that bow faster? I believe it had to do with the limb tip travel. And when you have a long travel, it takes longer to get there. It's kind of like on a racetrack when you take the inside turn, okay? And except for bows, it's different because the longer limb actually has to bend the least amount of space. All right, so there's other factors too. We talked about mass and materials. But we didn't talk about shape and design that much. And it's how much energy is stored into the bow. So this, believe it or not, is actually a long bowish It's a horse bow designed by Attila Kerensky, and he's retired now, but he was building bows for us for a long time. And you can see he's got a wedge here. It's called a saya, in this longbow reflex E-flex limb. And this bow barely works. And the reason being is because he was pushing the envelope. We built other ones that worked really well, that were super stable, but he's trying to get more speed, more speed. And if you see, I drew it out here on the limb tips are too far forward of center to be reliably stable. And I can measure that real quick. We're looking at about 5 inches, 5.25 inches forward of your handle. And it was just too much energy to be stable. The bow shoots fast, but it's right on the cusp of wanting to twist the limb. It's right on the cusp of being a little too much. Whereas if we had taken and brought that angle back a little bit, and so like for this bow, this one's strung, but when I unstring it, the limb tips are only like 2 inches in front of the handle. Okay? And so, anyway, you got to be careful how far forward in the handle you get. And, otherwise, you lose your stability and the wheels fall off the bus. But the shape is going to dictate your speed. And so we want to take into effect what is the mass of the limb. How far does the limb tip actually have to travel? And so that's why I brought this bow up next. This is actually a recurve. This is made by Border Bows. It's called the Gilly Doo, and it's a carbon maple bow. They have a radical, look at that radical turn in this brace bow. But what they have done is they have put in stiffeners right here on the back. You can see that the carbon is covered by laminated wood. That lamination, it makes it almost a static tip. It's not a true static tip because it will flex a little, but mostly static. And here's an interesting geometry that I'm going to get back to this. When you have a bow that's longer, your angle of arc is more acute. This is not the best drawing, it should be bigger. And you have a short bow, you have an acute angle of arc. When you have a longer bow, you have a more obtuse angle of arc. What difference does that make? Well, the difference it makes is accuracy. When you have a very tight angle of arc, as you let go of that string, it wants to stick to your fingers, and also it sends a wave of energy off your fingers and more exaggerated. Then if you have an obtuse angle of arc where it's really wide, it just slips off your fingers and you get less, you have less string oscillation during the launch cycle. Typically with a 28 to 30 inch draw, with a 3-finger release, you get about 3 string oscillations before the bow hits brace. When you shoot a thumb release, you get about 2 string oscillations before the bow gets brace with the same length. And it's because it's a larger oscillation coming off of your thumb that only has time to hit it twice before the bow stops. Anyway, if you can reduce that oscillation to minimal, then you get more accuracy. And so when you're chasing speed, you don't want to get this far forward. And when you're chasing speed, you don't want to make a really tight, obtuse angle of arc. Well, Border Bows, and with their engineers, figured out a way to make a horse bow where they took the saya idea, which is a static recurve tip. This is a horse bow with a traditional style saya. And this does 2 different things. It acts as a lever. It gives a mechanical advantage to the shooter, and it also does something kind of magical on their bow. If you look, this bow is a 56-inch bow, and it's considered a short bow, but for horseback archery, it's on the larger side. But when I draw this bow back, when these static tips kick in, they have a lever action, and what starts out at 56 inches goes between 48 and 60, because the tips at full draw, this bow does something that no other bow does. It actually gets longer. So it starts out as this short bow, but with the static tips on the recurve acting as a lever, it has a longer, more forgiving release. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. It has the right angle. It's not too far forward of the handle when it's unbraced. It's about 2.5 inches, half this distance, so it's stable. It's got these tight turns that act as levers. Another interesting thing about the levers in the saya is, and it's easier to see in this type of bow here. This is a Chinese Ming style bow. It has a shorter saya. It's about 9 inches long from here to here, a static wedge in there. This acts as a lever. If the geometry is right on the bow, then you get 2.5 pounds per inch all the way back to the sweet spot. Right in here, it no longer gives 2.5 pounds per inch because the lever effect of the static tip, you have a mechanical advantage. And this is the first mechanical advantage style bow where the horse bows. That means that I have about 1 inch of play because of the geometry of this bow, where if I go from 29 to 30 inches, the bow weight barely increases. That's a huge advantage when you're on horseback. You're shooting forward, you tend to short draw it, and when you shoot backward, you tend to long draw it. But with the right length bow and the good geometry, actually arrow speed doesn't change that much. I did this video for my new friends at Shatterproof Archery. It's a young company with young men that, or say young individuals that are super energetic and idealistic. And after watching some of their videos on speed and what makes a bow fast, I just reached out and we ended up talking. And these guys are pretty amazing. I really love what they're doing. And I love the idealism of trying to chase the 300 feet per second and try to make a traditional bow that'll bust that barrier. And I'd like to see him even bust the 230 foot per second barrier with a bow that's, under 60 pounds. And so, anyway, I'll do more videos for these guys if they're interested. And I just really want to see them do well and watch them fly.
Trey, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Your perspective has been fantastic for me. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone else who has joined us. We're getting close to 10,000 subscribers on this channel, which is very exciting. Stay shatterproof, and I'll see you on the next video.